Hello, welcome to Book Journey. Today, I want to introduce to you a book called The Chile Project, the story of the Chicago Boys and the downfall of neoliberalism. Chile is a small country in South America that you may not be very familiar with. However, the subtitle of this book hides a word that has influenced the world: the Chicago Boys and the Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism. Friends who are interested in economics must not be unfamiliar with the concept of neoliberalism. So, who are the Chicago Boys? What is the connection between neoliberalism and Chile? And what exactly is the Chile Project? Let me explain in detail. Neoliberalism can be said to be one of the most dominant economic schools of thought in the Western world over the past 40 years. Many well-known political and economic figures we are familiar with, such as Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Alan Greenspan, and in the academic world, Hayek, Friedman, and Becker, are all considered representatives of this ideology. Since the name contains the word new, neoliberalism must be different from classical liberalism, the omnipotent market and laissez-faire, advocated by Adam Smith and others. The Oxford University Press published a booklet called An Introduction to Neoliberalism, which defines it as follows: neoliberalism is the direct promotion by the state of policies such as privatization, deregulation, free trade, and deficit reduction in the economic field. In short, it aims to strengthen the core role of the market in resource allocation through artificial intervention, giving the market and capital the greatest say. This is precisely the opposite extreme of Keynesianism. What is particularly special is that neoliberalism is not an academic pursuit confined to the ivory tower. Since the 1980s, it has dominated the policymaking of many countries in Europe and America. For example, the North American Free Trade Agreement signed in 1992 and the shock therapy during Russia's economic transition are both products of neoliberalism. In 1989, top economists from the UK, the US, and other countries even prescribed 10 economic reform formulas for Latin American countries based on neoliberalist doctrine. They claimed that as long as these countries followed the formula, they could escape economic crises and achieve long-term prosperity. This formula is the famous Washington Consensus. Hearing this, you must have questions. An economic theory that has been adopted by so many countries and even regarded as a panacea must have some successful cases in reality, otherwise how could it convince people? Coincidentally, this book, The Chile Project, tells the earliest practical experience of neoliberal economics, and the process is full of drama. In the 1950s, a group of young Chilean students, with scholarships from their government, went to the University of Chicago in the United States to study economics. Their teachers were a few intellectuals who were not very mainstream at the time and were considered outliers in the academic world. Both teachers and students were sitting on cold benches, so they naturally felt a sense of mutual appreciation, and the issues they discussed were also freewheeling. Unfortunately, after these Chilean students returned to their country, they were not given important positions and were still waiting for seniority. Unexpectedly, in 1973, a military coup occurred in Chile. The newly established Pinochet regime, in an effort to revitalize the economy, employed this group of young expatriates. Some of them became finance ministers, while others became central bank governors, and they were given a somewhat derogatory nickname, the Chicago Boys. The prescription offered by the Chicago Boys was the neoliberal theory that their American teachers had taught them more than a decade earlier. This strong medicine initially had some difficulty adapting to the local conditions, but gradually it began to produce remarkable effects. In less than 15 years, Chile transformed from a country with severe inflation, a fiscal system on the brink of bankruptcy, and a GDP growth rate below the Latin American average, a laggard nation, into one of the world's most eye-catching emerging economies. It was the success of this Chilean experiment that spread the reputation of neoliberal economics worldwide. Not only did the UK and the US begin to emulate Chile, but after Pinochet's fall in 1990, Every subsequent Chilean government, regardless of whether it was left-wing or right-wing in politics, continued to follow the path of the Chicago Boys, even further promoting and expanding their policies. No wonder the Washington Consensus, based on the Chilean experience, became so popular. Thus, the Chile Project, in the book's title, actually has three layers of meaning. It refers to the scholarship program that initially trained economists, the plan to reform the Chilean economy based on neoliberal doctrine, and the vision of promoting the Chilean model worldwide. However, more than 40 years after the widespread adoption of neoliberal doctrine, in 2019, Chile erupted in nationwide protests. The protesters directly targeted neoliberal economics, arguing that it was the Chicago Boys' prescriptions that left Chile with a negative legacy of wealth inequality, high living costs, and insufficient social mobility, which needed to be corrected. Only then did the economics community realize that the so-called Chilean miracle was not based on solid foundations, and neoliberalism was not as magical as it seemed. Moreover, since the beginning of the 21st century, the halo of the Washington Consensus has also faded. The debt crises and political turmoil it has caused have become a new shackle for Latin America. Since the experiment with neoliberal economics began in Chile, to understand its real impact and inherent flaws, we must also review the Chilean experience. The Chile Project is an excellent monograph that reviews the rise and fall of neoliberal doctrine from the perspective of Chilean economic history. Its author, Sebastian Edwards, is a former chief economist for Latin America at the World Bank and currently a professor of international economics at the University of California, Los Angeles. Edwards himself is Chilean and has interacted with many members of the Chicago Boys. He has also widely engaged with critics of neoliberalism. Combining his professional research, he has conducted a complete review of Chile's economic history over the past half-century and wrote The Chile Project in 2023. The book was named one of the best economic books of 2023 by the Financial Times. Although it focuses on the case of Chile, it touches on the common issues faced by emerging countries around the world in developing their economies. After studying this book, you will not only learn about an academic theory and a historical story, but you will also gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of economic activity. Next, I will introduce the main content of this book in three parts. First, let's look at how neoliberal economics was introduced to Chile and the context in which the Chicago Boys dominated the formulation of Chile's economic policies. In the second part, I will take you through the achievements and serious problems that emerged during the years when neoliberal economics ruled Chile. Finally, I will summarize why neoliberal economics gradually declined at the beginning of the 21st century and how we should evaluate its merits and demerits from a historical perspective. To discuss the origins of the Chile Project, we must first delve into its historical context, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the early stages of the Cold War, there existed a vast neutral bloc between the two superpowers. Countries such as India, those in Central and South America, and North Africa fell into this category. In an effort to cultivate allies within these nations and bolster their influence, the U.S. and the USSR employed every possible means. In 1949, U.S. President Truman identified a problem. Although most neutral countries had established capitalist systems, their economies were extremely underdeveloped, with large populations living in poverty. Truman believed that this situation could provide an opportunity for the Soviet Union to exploit. He decided to launch a large-scale aid program, not only to provide financial assistance to neutral countries, but also to export technology, educational resources, and infrastructure to help these nations develop economically. In Truman's view, the U.S. had to demonstrate that capitalism could offer a better life to the people of neutral countries in order to outshine the Soviet Union. Within the U.S. foreign aid program, Chile held a unique position. In terms of economic endowment, Chile possessed the world's richest copper reserves, and its production of nitrates, silver, and wheat was also substantial, with partial industrialization already achieved. However, on the other hand, Chile was an extremely distorted country. Its inflation rate consistently exceeded 35%, with widespread rural poverty and a heavily indebted government. One of the reasons for this predicament was the lack of sufficient economic talent in Chile. According to the author of this book, in the early 1950s, the economics textbooks used in Chilean universities were still from the 19th century. The required courses for students involved blindfoldedly identifying dozens of types of imported fabrics by touch to calculate their tax rates. This was because the Chilean government believed that economics was all about taxation and credit, and anything else was nonsense. As for more complex professional knowledge, the universities simply could not teach it. The U.S. State Department, responsible for the foreign aid program, believed that Chile's economic foundation was solid, but what it lacked was professional talent. They proposed that starting from 1955, 5 to 10 senior students would be selected annually from Chile to receive full scholarships for a 2-year graduate education in economics in the United States. After returning to their country, these graduates could directly become university professors, serving as the seeds for professional education. This was the origin of the Chile Project. On the U.S. side, the University of Chicago in the Midwest was responsible for coordinating the Chile Project. You might wonder, since it was a national project, why not choose more prestigious universities like Harvard or Yale? The State Department's explanation was that the Chile Project was a highly purposeful initiative. It was not intended to merely gild the resumes of international students. Therefore, the prestige of the university was not the most important factor. What mattered was a rigorous academic atmosphere. The University of Chicago, known for its low-key and pragmatic approach, seemed to fit the bill. However, the State Department apparently failed to realize that the University of Chicago's economics department was considered non-mainstream in the U.S. at the time. The young faculty there not only fiercely criticized Keynesianism, but were also in the process of formulating their own theoretical framework. As soon as the Chilean students arrived in Chicago, they became the experimental fields for these American professors' ideas, embarking on a unique path. Here, it is important to provide some background knowledge. After the 1929 Great Depression, the U.S., following Keynesian doctrine, implemented expansionary fiscal policies to intervene in the employment and investment markets, achieving satisfactory results. Therefore, until the 1950s, Keynesianism, which advocated state intervention, remained the mainstream in the U.S. economics community. However, after World War II, the U.S. experienced intermittent growth stagnation and high inflation. Economists at the University of Chicago believed that the culprit behind these negative phenomena was Keynesianism, and they launched academic critiques against it. Coincidentally, the Chilean government at the time was also a believer in Keynesianism, with extensive economic regulations. The Chilean students found that the lessons taught by their professors were not detached from reality and had many intersections with Chile's national conditions, and they quickly became ardent followers. Speaking of the American professors who taught the Chilean students, they later became known as the Chicago School of Economics, with 14 members eventually receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics. However, in the late 1950s, these future academic luminaries were mostly in their 30s and 40s, and were not yet well known in the academic world. Yet their critical views were extremely sharp. To give a few examples, the professor who taught the Chilean students the most was the future Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. Friedman's core view was that the soul of economic policy is not growth or employment, but the money supply. As long as the money supply is rational, the market mechanism can function on its own, driving employment and growth. Therefore, the state, especially the central bank, should minimize macroeconomic and maintaining a long-term low growth rate of the money supply would suffice. As for a certain degree of inflation, that is a normal phenomenon and should not cause alarm. Another American professor, Haberger, although not as radical, also believed that increasing taxes by the government would disrupt the market's resource allocation function, leading to reduced economic efficiency, and thus must be firmly rejected. Hearing this, you may have already realized that the Chicago School was not only a group of market fundamentalists, but also more radical than their ancestor, Adam Smith. Smith merely stated that the invisible hand of the market was important and that the government should act as a night watchman. The Chicago School, however, went further, claiming that the vast majority of historical economic crises and recessions were caused by reckless macroeconomic. The government should not only interfere less, but also actively limit its own actions, leaving decision-making to the market and capital. In their view, issues that ordinary people care about, such as employment, pensions, and inflation, could not be effectively managed by the government. The best government should withstand public pressure and let the market function on its own. In the long run, this approach would be the most efficient and least likely to deviate from ideal economics. From today's perspective, it is not difficult to see the fallacies in these doctrines. Theory should serve specific people. How could it disregard the livelihoods and feelings of ordinary people just to prove its correctness? However, looking at it from another angle, if the Chicago School had remained confined to universities without influencing the wider world, its negative consequences might not have been severe. The problem was that these immature theories and hypotheses were first instilled into the Chilean students. These young people in their early 20s, having just arrived at the University of Chicago, were immediately captivated by their professors' eloquence, quick minds, and the series of models and data they presented. In their eyes, the theories of the Chicago School were precisely the remedy to rescue Chile from poverty. According to the author of this book, among the first batch of 9 Chilean students who went to Chicago, there later emerged a central bank governor, a finance minister, a presidential advisor, and a major entrepreneur, all of whom could influence reality. However, the transition from academia to government required a process. In 1958, the first batch of Chilean students graduated and returned to their country, immediately becoming university professors and beginning to establish an economics education system for their homeland. They thrived in the academic world, but their influence could never penetrate the political sphere. The reason was simple. In the early 1960s, Marxist economics was introduced to Chile. Its explanations of surplus value, poverty, and international division of labor were highly persuasive and quickly attracted Chile's center-left politicians. On the contrary, the American educated students, always advocating theories from the ivory tower and criticizing all government actions, were not popular. The term Chicago Boys was coined at that time to describe these expatriates who, despite their youth, loved to lecture on everything, always citing the Chicago School. On one occasion, Chilean President Alessandri asked the Chicago Boys to draft a reform plan to tackle inflation. The Chicago Boys replied that inflation was a normal phenomenon and did not need to be addressed. The president angrily exclaimed, "Drive these madmen back to the United States. I never want to see them again." The turning point came in 1970. That year, Marxist Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile through democratic elections. He announced the nationalization of Chile's copper mines and banking industry, established a universal welfare system, and granted substantial wage increases to the working class. The intentions behind these policies were undoubtedly good. The problem was that changes in ownership and investors would lead to short-term reductions in manufacturing output and insufficient supply of goods. With less supply, prices naturally had to rise. On the one hand, the Allende government promised wage increases, while on the other hand, it froze prices, putting itself in a corner. With no new sources of revenue, the government had no choice but to print money, causing the inflation rate to soar above 300% within 2 years, severe fiscal deficits, and widespread complaints. More importantly, as Chile's long-standing largest trading partner, the United States now began to target Allende. They incited opponents within Chile to create disturbances and caused a series of chaos. In September 1973, with U.S. support, Army Commander Pinochet launched a military coup and overthrew the Allende regime. Chile thus entered a 17-year period of military dictatorship. So, what connection did the Chicago Boys have with this coup? It turned out that before Pinochet took action, he brought in 11 economists to draft a comprehensive plan to reform Chile's economy. Among these 11 individuals, 9 were Chicago Boys. The plan they wrote was reportedly over 60 centimeters thick and resembled a brick, hence the nickname Brick Plan. It was in the Brick Plan that radical proposals such as privatization, deregulation, and tariff reduction first appeared. Pinochet himself was somewhat skeptical, but in 1975, Friedman, the mentor of the Chicago Boys, flew to Chile and publicly supported his students. Friedman warned Pinochet that Chile was a country on the brink of bankruptcy and that the Brick Plan was the only hope for saving the government. Pinochet immediately announced that 3 Chicago Boys would take charge of the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the Central Budget Office, respectively, to begin comprehensive reforms. Thus, these young scholars, just over 40 years old, and with no political experience, unexpectedly began a reform experiment with an entire nation. This was a rare case in world history. Alright, we have just reviewed the early experiences of the Chicago Boys and their unique entry into the political arena. Now, let's look at how the Brick Plan changed Chile's economy. The first prescription it offered was called shock therapy. This term means that in the short term, all public budgets would be cut by 15%, and at the same time, support for state-owned enterprises would be eliminated to reduce the deficit rate. It is like a patient who has been bedridden for a long time and suddenly has all the intravenous tubes removed. He will go into shock. The Chicago Boys believed that although this approach was cruel, it could activate the spontaneous role of the market. The enterprises that survived the shock would have strong vitality and would be qualified market players in the future. As for the enterprises that died, their profitability was originally poor, so it was not a pity to eliminate them. From here, you will find that the Chicago Boys' imagination of economic activities is highly abstract. In their minds, there are only big words like market, liberalization, and money supply. As for how many people would be unemployed and how many would be ruined by the shock therapy, they simply did not care. It was only with the military support of the Pinochet regime that they could conduct experiments on an entire country. In any normal country, if someone were to implement such a therapy that defied public outrage, the government would probably have collapsed long ago. Think about it, during Allende's tenure, he had just implemented nationalization, wage increases, and universal welfare. Before the previous problems were resolved, the Chicago Boys reversed course, and the results were predictable. Within a year, Chile's unemployment rate soared to 22% and remained high. Those who had jobs saw their incomes shrink by a quarter. But with government subsidies and all welfare programs cut, the severe fiscal deficit finally disappeared. The Chicago Boys considered this a great success. The second prescription was a two-pronged approach to imports and exports. On one side, the exchange rate of the local currency against the US dollar was devalued by 90% to stimulate exports. On the other side, the import tax on goods was reduced to 10% to attract foreign goods and companies to enter the Chilean market. This subsequently led to the third prescription, namely privatization and financial liberalization. The Chicago Boys believed that Chile's traditional large state-owned enterprises, especially those in mining and manufacturing, had only obtained domestic market share through trade protectionism. Their profit margins and operational efficiency were too low and had to be abandoned. Therefore, starting in 1973, 92% of Chile's 596 major state-owned enterprises were sold within a decade. Of course, the world's largest state-owned copper company remained in government hands. To provide ammunition for privatization, the Chilean government also relaxed financial regulations, allowing domestic banks to borrow from overseas and then lend to private enterprises. On paper, this indeed gave a shot in the arm to economic growth and looked very promising. Of course, it was impossible to completely disregard the livelihoods of the lower classes. Around 1980, the Chilean government passed two social bills. One stipulated that in labor negotiations, the increase in workers' wages could not be lower than the inflation rate. The other announced the reform of the pension system. Everyone had to deposit 10% of their salary into a pension fund, which the government would invest in the market, such as in newly established private enterprises. When employees retired, they could use the money in their accounts to purchase government-guaranteed pension annuities. The Chicago Boys believed that this was also solving problems through the market. Since funds and annuities are financial products that can be spontaneously regulated by the market, companies would no longer have any other burdens besides regular wage increases and would be more competitive. Clearly, this was another plan based on paper calculations. How effective was this series of combination punches? The answer is 4 words: unpredictable. In 1977, Chile's GDP growth rate soared to 10%, exceeding the South American average. The Chicago Boys were ecstatic, and their mentor Friedman even publicly declared it the Chilean miracle, a victory for the Chicago school. However, the problems of high unemployment and high inflation remained unresolved. In a final push, the Chilean government announced in 1979 that it would switch to a fixed exchange rate system. The problem was that a strong local currency would affect exports. Under the constraints of the social bill, companies could not arbitrarily reduce wages. Operating costs remained high while revenues decreased, and companies gradually could not repay their bank loans. The capital of Chilean banks was borrowed in US dollars from overseas, which triggered a chain reaction. In 1982, Chile experienced a debt crisis, with GDP dropping by 14% in a single year and per capita income quickly reverting to the level of 1960. The crisis of 1982 was a heavy blow to the Chicago Boys. Some of them were forced to resign and leave the government. However, the influence of the Chicago school did not disappear, as the newly appointed finance minister, Bish, was also an American-educated expatriate. He believed that the prescriptions in the BRIC plan were not wrong. They were just poorly timed. Now, with the Chilean economy having just gone through a reshuffling and the local currency significantly devalued, it was the perfect time to restart the growth engine. Therefore, Bish also launched his 3-pronged approach. First, he allowed debt-to-equity swaps, selling severely loss-making companies to foreign investors but prohibiting capital withdrawal for 10 years, raising $1 billion in this way. Second, he increased investment in infrastructure to boost employment. Third, he adopted a floating exchange rate system to fully integrate domestic and foreign markets. These measures were called pragmatic neoliberalism and became the core of the so-called Chilean model. Stimulated by the new policies, Chile's economy began to grow again from 1983, with GDP growth rates reaching as high as 12.5% at one point. This restored the Chicago Boys' reputation. Despite the end of military rule in 1990, the newly elected civilian government promised not to change the neoliberal model that was already on the right track. This situation continued into the second decade of the 21st century. If we look only at the paper data, Chile is the country with the highest per capita income in South America. Its average annual GDP growth rate is also higher than that of neighboring countries. The problem is that even in the best years, Chile's unemployment rate never dropped below 6%, and the poverty rate remained above 20% for a long time. The author of this book provides an explanation. As the world's largest copper producer, copper mining accounts for 13.5% of Chile's GDP and 44% of its commodity export value. The state-owned copper company, which was not privatized, provides the government with a bottom-line income. Although the international price of copper fluctuates greatly, it usually acts as a safety valve. A reliable and stable income, a market mechanism tempered by repeated crises, and a population of less than 20 million have created the success of the Chilean model on paper. As for the impact of neoliberalism, it is at most only one of the reasons, and by no means a secret recipe. Alright, we have just reviewed the history of the practice of neoliberal economics in Chile. You may not know that around the end of the Cold War, the Chilean model was highly known worldwide. Friedman himself recommended that the US and UK governments emulate Chile and implement neoliberal reforms. In the Washington Consensus, it was used by the World Bank as a standard template to be sold to Latin American countries. Shock therapy was also faithfully imitated by Russia during its transition in the early 1990s. However, those countries that imitated Chile did not have its copper mines, nor did they have such a small population. Except for large countries like the UK and the US, all attempts by developing countries to copy the Chilean model almost ended in failure, leaving behind heavy foreign debts and turbulent political situations. The performance of shock therapy in Russia turned into a shocking tragedy. Nobel laureate and former World Bank chief economist Stiglitz once said, "An excessive belief in the market is a complete mistake." So, what do the Chileans themselves think? Time has given the answer. In October 2019, more than 1.2 million Chileans poured into the streets of the capital to protest the increase in subway fares. They listed a series of alarming figures. The wealthiest 1% of Chileans own 48% of the country's wealth. Until 2015, the national extreme poverty rate had never dropped below 10%. The pensions that the Chicago boys promised to be solved by the market were actually only equivalent to 25% of pre-retirement wages. Due to the excessive industrialization of higher education, students who attended private universities had to spend an average of 15 years to repay their student loans. And the low-income groups in the capital, who could only take the subway operated by private companies to commute, had to spend 1/8 of their monthly income on commuting, the highest proportion in all of South America. This protest eventually lasted for 2 years, and what people wanted was no longer piecemeal reforms but a complete end to neoliberal economics and the creation of a new constitution. As of the summer of 2024, the debates and negotiations surrounding Chile's new constitution were still ongoing. But one thing is certain: market fundamentalism did not solve the real problems of most Chileans, especially the low-income groups. Their grievances and dissatisfaction would not be resolved just because Chile was listed as a high-income country by the World Bank, or because the overall economic indicators looked particularly good. Chile's economic miracle and growth performance are undoubtedly facts. However, whether they were directly brought about by a single economic theory or an elite group is doubtful. In today's world, neoliberalism has become a school of thought with mixed reviews. Everything has come back to that fundamental question: is it that theory serves specific people, or that people become the carriers and tools of theory? Alright, that concludes the introduction to the main content of the Chile project. From 1955 to 1970, over 100 Chilean students obtained economics degrees from the University of Chicago through a scholarship program. It was this highly concentrated group of intellectual elites that brought neoliberal doctrine back to their homeland and dominated Chile's economic development after 1973. However, their arrogance, narrow-mindedness, and detachment from reality ultimately turned the Chicago boys into a derogatory term. History has repeatedly proven that the primary characteristic of economic activity is its complexity. There is no development model that can be infinitely replicated, nor is there any academic theory that can be misused. Perhaps this is the most important lesson from the book The Chile Project.